Let's look at this claim that some of the teachings of Yeshua are completely un-Jewish, and there's no possible way that any Jew would have uttered these, and they're dangerous and so on. But against the context of first century Jewish teaching, there's the one account we have, for example, in Matthew, the 8th chapter, where someone wants to follow him, and Yeshua says, "Follow me." And he said, "All right, let me first bury my father, and then I'll follow you." And Yeshua says, "Let the dead bury their own dead. Come and follow me." How un-Jewish can you get? Well, there's no question he was saying, put me first. Put the Messiah first. Put loyalty to me first. But what we see with the others is that there were cheap excuses he was getting past. It's possible that this man is just saying, my dad's old. Let me wait till he dies and bury you. I got to be responsible, and then I'll come follow you. And Yeshua just knew it was procrastination. That's why he said what he said. But there's another view, and that is that there's evidence of a second burial that would take place some months after, a year after the actual burial, where the bones or what was left would be unearthed and then buried a second time. There's some Jewish evidence for that. And some say that that's what he was talking about. And Yeshua was saying, go on. The dead bury their own dead. Your father's dead and gone. Move on now and follow me. Yes, it's a radical call and meant to be radical without compromise. But when you realize that he's always cutting through excuses that don't really work, some scholars, Jewish included, have said maybe it was the second burial they were talking about. He wasn't saying, your dad just died, you got to bury him within 24 hours now, or leave. No, you don't have to say that that's what he was saying. Okay, let's think of a couple of others, though. In Matthew, the 5th chapter, the famous Sermon on the Mount, Yeshua says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now, he's not talking about self-defense, because he's dealing with the issue of, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's called in Latin lex talionis, retaliatory law. This is still practiced in Saudi Arabia, for example, or Iran, where, let's say, you viciously blind someone, that person can now petition the court to have you blinded. Or you get in a fight with someone and you're on the ground, you beat them and you paralyze them, that now the courts can have you paralyzed if the person refuses a bribe, a payment, not a bribe, a payment. If they said, no payment is enough, I want the same thing to happen. There are actually cases like this in the last few years that have come up and stirred world controversy in Iran and in Saudi Arabia. So biblical law, if taken literally, someone caused you to lose your eye, they lose their eye. Now, rabbinic teaching is that it was always monetary payment. It was never literally lex talionis. But that's another subject. What we know is that Jesus is not talking about self-defense. He's not saying if someone breaks into your home and rapes your wife, that you say, oh, by the way, I've got 2 teenage daughters down the hallway, sir, just go over there. No, he's not saying that. He's talking about legal retaliation. That's the context. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Okay, so right-handedness is presumed in the Bible, right? And that's the vast majority of people are right-handed. So that's presumed. Right-handedness, if someone strikes you on the right, whoa, hang on. If I take my right hand and strike you, I strike you on the left cheek. What's being presupposed here? A backhanded slap. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, boom, a backhanded slap. What's the significance of that? Well, in the Mishnah, and these laws well could have been current or at the very least developing in Yeshua's day, if someone publicly gave you a backhanded slap, you were entitled to a certain amount of monetary compensation, twice the amount, whereas if they had just slapped you with the front of their hand. So a backhanded slap to your right cheek, you were entitled double compensation. Yeshua says, no. You step higher. Love those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who persecute you. Don't try to retaliate. Don't try to have a vengeful spirit. You bless and leave justice and judgment to God. That's how Paul explains it in Romans, the 12th chapter. Quoting from Proverbs 25, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. So even if you're entitled to public compensation for public shame, let him slap you on the other cheek. Don't worry about it. Step higher. Step higher. It makes sense when put in Jewish context. It has nothing to do with self-defense. Nothing whatsoever to do with self-defense. What about when Jesus says, give to him who asks you? Give to him who asks you. Matthew 5, Luke 6. I actually had a counter-missionary come up to me once outside of a Jewish bookstore. He just wanted me to give him what I had, give him the keys to my car, just give it to him. And I kind of went along with his game for a little while, and then it was just a game. But he was trying to say, look, you can't do what Jesus literally said to do. No one can practice that. Well, is there a Jewish context to that as well? Absolutely. Absolutely. Luke 6, Yeshua says that we should give to those who ask and lend expecting nothing in return. And he also explains that if we just lend to people who can pay us back, well, we're just doing what anybody else would do, what sinners would do. What any greedy person would do if they had the money for loan, you can pay me back? Yeah, I'll do it, that's fine. Well, what's the issue here? Very simple. It was Jewish law every 7th year. If you lent someone money, 7th year came and they couldn't finish paying it back, that they would be released. The 50th year, they'd be released from all debts. Lifetime servants would be released. Indentured land would be returned to owners, the Jubilee year. There's some scholars who believe that Yeshua was started his ministry in a Jubilee year in a 50th year, a year of debt release, at least on a 7th year. Well, there was a problem. God warned our people, Deuteronomy 15, don't be stingy. Don't think, well, the 7th year is approaching. Hang on. God's going to come to me for a loan. I loan him this money. It's the 5th year in this cycle. I loan him the money. He's going to pay me back for 6 months, a year and a half. Then the 7th year comes, and now he's free from the loan. I'm not going to lend him the money. I'm never going to get it back. Bad enough I can't charge interest to a fellow Jew, fellow Israelite, but I'm never going to get the money back at all. God said, don't think like that. Don't be greedy. No. Just bless. Just give, and God will bless you. Observing the Torah required supernatural faith. It required supernatural faith. Well, Hillel, who was the last of the so-called Zugot, the teaching pairs that were leading generations, Hillel and Shammai being the older contemporaries of Yeshua in the 1st century, which is then followed by the period of what's called the Tanaim, out of which the Mishnah is produced, and then followed by the period of what's called the Amoraim, out of which the Talmud is produced, the Amoraim and the Savaraim, out of which the Talmud is produced. Don't worry about all those terms right now. We'll actually come back to them right towards the end of this series of lectures. But Hillel developed something called the Prosbul. What was the Prosbul? It was a document that you would sign that said, when I am lending money to this poor person, they don't pay me back, they pay back the court. Because there was nothing that said that the court had to abide by this 7th year release, just the individual lender. So this was a way, a compassionate way of saying, okay, we want poor people to be able to get loans. We want them to be able to make it. However, we know that it's a hardship on the wealthy because many times they don't get their money back when the 7th year release comes. This way, everybody will be okay. The poor people will eventually pay back the loan to the court. The court gives it to the person that lent the money, and the other person is more willing to lend their money. Well, what it did is it bypassed the supernatural faith element. It bypassed the total dependence on God element. So, what does Yeshua say? In this very context, that's how we should understand it. Give to him who asks you. From him who would borrow, don't turn him away. Lend, expecting nothing in return. In other words, go ahead and do what the Torah told you to do. Do it in faith. And if you're not paid back in an earthly way, your heavenly Father will pay you back. He wasn't telling you that if someone knocks on your door, give me your house, please. I'd like your house. Hang on. I see you bought a new house. Give me that. Oh, excuse me. New car, I'd like that car. Oh, wardrobe. Give me. No, he was not saying that. He was encouraging his fellow Jews to do in faith what God had commanded them to do, and God's blessing would be on them. You put it in the Jewish context, oh, now it makes perfect sense. Some argue that Yeshua was a false prophet, that he claimed that his apostles would live to see his return, a prediction he missed by at least 2,000 years. He also predicted that not one stone in Jerusalem would be left standing when the Romans destroyed it. Well, have you ever heard of the Wailing Wall? Well, actually, Wailing Wall was not part of the temple. This is a later extension to the temple. It was not physically part of the temple. But in Luke it says, in Jerusalem, no stone will be left upon another. Look at the Wailing Wall. What about the idea that he made clear that he was coming back in that generation, that his own disciples would see him return? Well, when you look at the account of the Transfiguration, which interestingly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke follows immediately on his statement that there's some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in glory, coming in his kingdom. Well, in point of fact, about a week later, they saw him glorified, coming in kingdom power. And then John, on the Isle of Patmos, has a vision, a revelation of Jesus in kingdom power and glory. So they did get to see that. Elsewhere, he warned, he talked about in parables that he would be going away. It'd be like a king going away on a long journey. On a long journey. And he warned about people thinking, he's not going to come back and so on. So he's already preparing the way for this. When he talks about certain things that had to happen in Matthew 24, in Mark 13, Luke 21, and that this generation would see these things, this generation would not pass away before all these things fulfilled. Either he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which did take place at that time, and not about his ultimate return, which is separate, which he then says, no man knows the day, no man knows the hour. That's a totally legitimate way of reading it. Some argue when he says this generation, he means this race, meaning the Jewish people, and that they will not cease to exist until he returns, which of course would be true. And others would interpret it that he's saying, look, the ones that see this final upheaval, these things happen, which was not the destruction of the temple in his day, or a generation after, but the end time destruction of the temple, that there'll be a rebuilt third temple, that'll be destroyed. When you see this happen, know that the coming of Messiah is near. That could be an interpretation as well. But I have no problem whatsoever with saying that he's first talking about the destruction of the temple, these things. When you see this, it's going to happen in your day. And there's going to be judgment, the Son of Man bringing judgment, and you'll see it happen in your day. And now separately, his end time return, no one knows the day or the hour. You say, yeah, but hang on. He said every stone would be undone, no stone left on another. And here we've got this remnant of the outside wall of the temple complex. You know, it's wild to think of this. He spoke of the horrific suffering that would happen to our people, and it happened. He warned about it. He wept over it. As he was on his way to be crucified, and women were weeping, he said, don't weep for me, weep for what's coming on your city, weep for what's coming on your people. And one of the most striking things, even though the stones of the temple were absolutely massive, it was an architectural wonder that they were put together the way they were and how they were brought in and all of this. The Romans raised the city, they flattened the city, they flattened the temple, raised, R-A-Z. They raised it. They flattened it. One of the things that Yeshua spoke of so accurately that people say, they made it up after. He didn't really say it. They made it up afterwards. No, these are things he declared in advance, and they happened strikingly. One of my colleagues said, could you imagine as the city is destroyed, as thousands or hundreds of thousands of Jews are dying and thousands of Jews are being crucified? And there's terrible, terrible suffering in the city, and the temple itself flattened, and Jerusalem flattened all around, that someone says, look, there's some stones on top of each other. He's a false prophet. What a ridiculous scenario. In point of fact, when you look at prophetic language in the Hebrew Scriptures, when you look at how the prophets spoke about the destruction of Judea through the Babylonians, they spoke of it in broad terms, in sweeping terms of what was going to happen throughout all the cities, and it only happened in some of the cities, and it didn't happen exactly as they said. Even in the worst of the cities, it was more or less snapshots that they gave you of destruction and what would be called prophetic hyperbole. If we said some tragedy happens in a certain country, this country is going to be decimated and wiped out, every family affected, and everyone's going to lose loved ones. And then the tsunami hits, the terrible tsunami we had a few years ago. Someone might say, well, it was every single family, did each one, or you could say, wow, it happened as prophesied. Actually, one of the great proofs that we have of Yeshua's accuracy as a prophet is the way he spoke of the destruction of Jerusalem. If we can in fact demonstrate that the prophecies were spoken and written before the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was destroyed, all the more do we look to him as a trustworthy prophet. There are other attacks on Jesus, Yeshua in the New Testament. Let's just say they're more minor, and I'm not going to get into all of those, but I want to tackle a few more things. One argument is that the teachings of the New Testament may have started out Jewish, but before long they became totally pagan. This was done intentionally since the Jews rejected Yeshua as Messiah and only the pagans would listen to the message. Well, actually, the New Testament itself records that by the time of Acts 21, there were tens of thousands of Jews living in Jerusalem who believed in Yeshua and were zealous for the Torah. Tens of thousands. So we have that account. We also have the fact that Matthew, one of the four Gospels, is clearly written for Jewish believers. It's written to reach Jewish people with the good news of Messiah, but it's primarily written as a discipleship manual for Jewish believers. And it's clear that the Yeshua of Matthew is not tearing down Torah, but bringing it to fulfillment. And then what's also clear is we have the letter of Jacob, clearly written to Jewish believers and clearly talking to them about obeying Torah in the life of the Spirit. So to say it's un-Jewish or becomes pagan is absolutely contrary to the text. I mean, the book of Revelation, which we have as the last book of the New Testament, actually pictures the city of God that comes down from above. It's the New Jerusalem. And the 12 pillars of the city are the names of the 12 Jewish apostles, emissaries. And then the 12 gates are the names of the 12 tribes. It hardly stops being Jewish at the end. And the Messiah is known as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And even at the end, he's the descendant of David. Even at the end of Revelation. What you have is Paul writing letters to Gentile believers. What you have is Paul addressing Gentile believers who had no previous connection with Torah law and no previous connection with Israel, except those that would have been God-fearing Gentiles that attended synagogue services before. And even in that context, 1 Corinthians 5, Paul writes to the Corinthians about Passover, understanding that they know what Passover is, and then makes reference to first fruits in 1 Corinthians 15. And then we'll talk about, say, in Romans 15, how the Gentile believers have a debt to help the Jewish believers in Jerusalem financially. And Paul, when he traveled to the Gentile congregations, was often raising money to help the Jewish believers in Jerusalem because they suffered from more poverty and hardship. It hardly becomes pagan. The pagans are called to turn from their paganism and turn from their idolatry. Instead, what you have is now Paul communicating the values of the one true God to Gentiles who were not obligated to keep all of the Torah of Moses and who were not familiar with all the Torah of Moses. You say, yeah, but I mean, the New Testament institutes Easter and Christmas. No, it doesn't. It doesn't even mention them. None of those things were heard of. I see in the King James Bible, in Acts 12, it mentions Easter. It's a mistranslation. Greek is Pascha, the Passover. It's a mistranslation, all that is. So in point of fact, there's nothing pagan in the New Testament. You say, well, what about the myth of a dying, rising God? That has nothing to do with the Messiah, the righteous Messiah who takes on himself the sins of the world as a vicarious sacrifice, dies, and rises from the dead in accordance with the prophecies of the Scriptures. No connection between the dying, rising God. And as we saw earlier, there's no connection with the so-called virgin birth, pagan God myth. No connection whatsoever with that and Yeshua's birth. Some have said, yeah. I mean, Jesus was really all right. Jesus was okay. In fact, my book, The Real Kosher Jesus, I wrote to respond to my friend Rabbi Shmuley, who wrote a book called Kosher Jesus. Rabbi Shmuley said, yeah, Jesus was a great rabbi. He was a great teacher. He was a loyal Jew. In fact, Rabbi Shmuley thinks he was a freedom fighter who died fighting against Rome. Of course, it's an unlikely scenario. He's got 11 disciples with 3 swords, and they're going to bring down Rome, but that's another story. Jesus was all right. He was a good Jew, fine rabbi. It was Paul who messed everything up and founded Christianity. Of course, what I find funny is the fact that out of one breath, Yeshua is being attacked as being un-Jewish and dangerous. Now, the other breath, well, he was fine. It's Paul. That's the problem. Actually, when you look at it in depth, you find that Paul carries out the message of Yeshua, and that Paul is in harmony with the message of Yeshua. And when you look at what Paul taught and then go back and see what Yeshua taught, you see, oh, these actually line up. And his beliefs about Yeshua's death and resurrection and return are in keeping with what the other writers in the New Testament say as well. In point of fact, the book of Acts tells us that Paul continued to live as an observant Jew. He continued to live as a religious Jew. When he was reaching Gentiles with the good news of the Messiah, is it possible in order to reach people that had never heard the message, he would eat something that he wouldn't normally have eaten? It could well be. And he would have said that's a principle now, that the most important thing is to bring the message of the one true God to the nations. We don't know that he did that, but you can argue that he may have based on some passages, or we can reconstruct that potentially. But the fact of the matter was, otherwise, he lived as a Jew. Why? Because he was a Jew. And the Messiah coming didn't mean you stopped being Jewish, and it didn't mean you threw out Torah. What it meant was now you live it out through the life of the Spirit. You see, there are only 2 ways to go, basically. Well, let's say 3 ways. You have the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. You either say, okay, we don't understand exactly how to keep all the laws, and God gives us traditions and understanding and interpretations, and that grows and grows and grows and grows and grows until we have Talmud, we have the law codes, we have the responsa literature, we have the ongoing rabbinic traditions and so-called Yam HaTalmud, the sea of the Talmud, and on and on and on. You either have that, so you have rabbinic Judaism, or you have what the Karaites did. They rejected the rabbinic traditions. There's a handful of Karaites that still remain today, but numbered in the thousands. They rejected what the rabbis said and went back to the text, and they said, hey, this is the way it's always been. These rabbis added things on without authority. We just go back to the biblical text and use the biblical text to draw our interpretation. But then even out of that, then they develop their traditions. Or you say, and we'll pick up with this in the next class, or you say, most of what's written in the Torah we can't do today. We don't have a temple standing. We don't have blood sacrifices. We don't have a functioning priesthood. We don't even have a religious rule at that kind of sovereignty in the land of Israel to fully carry everything out. And for most of our history, then, we haven't been able to do these. Is it possible there's a better way? Plus, we don't put adulterers to death now. We don't burn witches. We don't do those things that Torah law commanded. We don't practice levirate marriage, in other words, polygamy, under any circumstances. So could it be that these laws were spoken and were utterly true and were for the people, but that was not the end? The end was the coming of the Messiah, or I should say the goal was the coming of the Messiah, Greek telos, which can mean end or goal, that it all functioned to bring us to Messiah. Now that Messiah has come, he brings us into a new and better covenant and takes the life-giving principles of the Torah and writes them in our hearts, so that as we love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbors ourselves, we will now carry out the righteous requirements of the law. In other words, Messiah points us to a new and better way. It's not anti-Torah, it's not contrary to the Torah, rather it's building on what the Torah taught and shows us the Torah is pointing to the coming of Messiah in the world. Now he gives the Spirit. Now we can live these things out in a new and better way, including Sabbath, including the meaning of the biblical calendar, including holiness principles. He empowers us to live them out in a new and better way. So we want to look at Yeshua and the law, Paul and the law, and then in our very last lecture, we'll look at a response to the idea that there's been an unbroken chain of tradition going all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai. Thanks so much for watching the broadcast. One of our viewers recently communicated to me, there's nothing more important that you can be doing. And you know, we hear from Jewish people through our materials, they've come to faith in Jesus Yeshua. Others had fallen away and they've come back to the Lord. Christians tell us they're now equipped to reach Jewish people with the gospel. And we have amazing open doors before us to reach more and more Jewish people than ever before, but we need your help. Everything we do is a team effort. Would you join together with us and become part of our team? Go to my website right now, askdrbrown.org, askdrbrown.org. Click on the support banner, the TV support banner, and join us. And for your gift of any size, I want to send you this book. I'm going to sign it for you. It's an exclusive hardcover edition of my book, The Real Kosher Jesus, which was written and published in a miraculous 10 weeks' time. I'll send it to you for your gift of any size. Go to askdrbrown.org, click on the TV support banner, become a monthly supporter, help us with a one-time gift, and friend, be assured that together we're making a difference in the salvation of Israel.
Please visit our website or call and ask how you can receive access to our countless free resources. Learn exciting information on what is happening around the world and with our ministry today. When you visit our website, be sure to check out our bookstore for the latest videos, books, and more. You may want to join us during an upcoming radio broadcast. Please contact us today for more information. Please remember, this ministry depends on tax-deductible donations from viewers like you.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Answering Your Toughest Questions. We are in the midst of our series on answering Jewish objections to Jesus. And these weeks, we have focused on some of those tough New Testament objections. Even followers of Jesus, committed followers of Jesus, read some of these texts and they wonder, boy, did the New Testament writers rightly understand what was being said by the Jewish writers of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scriptures? And I don't understand how some of these things work. Well, that's what we're unfolding every week right here during our series on answering Jewish objections to Jesus. So tune in to next week's episode as we continue answering New Testament objections to the faith. And we invite all of you, if you're Jewish watching this broadcast, write to us at askdrbrown.org. Let us help you grow in your faith. And all of you, be sure to tune in next week as we continue on answering your toughest questions.
This has been a paid program made possible by financial contributions to Ask Dr. Brown Ministries from viewers like you in your area. Thank you for your support.